All right, well, welcome back everyone to the CRA Ransomware Summit. My name is Derek Johnson. I'm a cybersecurity reporter with SC Media. Welcome to our fireside chat. I'm very excited today because we have with us Herb Stapleton, who is a section chief at the FBI's cyber division. And needless to say, when it comes to ransomware, this is an issue that he and his team have been knee-deep in. And are really, I think, fantastically positioned to give us some insights into what the FBI and other law enforcement organizations are doing to meet this threat, how these ransomware groups are evolving their operations, and really sort of what IT security teams need to keep in mind as they go about setting up their own protections and defenses against it. So welcome, Herb. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure.
Great. Could we sort of just start off with you giving us sort of a status update on the state of ransomware right now, kind of where you're seeing areas of most concern, where you think organizations like the FBI are having success, and where there might be room to maybe improve or get better, either at the Bureau or in terms of the cooperation that you see between the government and the private sector?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, in a word, if I were going to give a status update on the state of ransomware, unfortunately, that word would be growing. I think from a threat perspective, it's a growing trend, and we certainly don't deny that. In fact, I think it really kind of motivates us to redouble our efforts to try to combat this threat to the best of our ability. So when I see sort of where we are as the FBI in particular, I think you really hit the key word, which is cooperation, or even put another way, collaboration. The cyber threat landscape is a environment where a team effort is really required to kind of counter those threats, and nowhere is that more obvious than in ransomware, in my opinion. So what we are really trying to do at the FBI is build the broadest coalition of partnerships that we can between the FBI and other parts of the government, and between the government, the FBI specifically, and our partners in the private sector, because we know that that's really where we're going to find the best threat intelligence is out there in the private sector, and we know that in many ways we can have a complementary relationship in which the private sector can inform what we as the FBI are targeting. It can help us prioritize our work and know what to go after. And in turn, the things that we learn through our investigations, we can work with our partners in government to make sure that the private sector has those types of indicators that they can use to harden their own defenses.
Yeah, let's stay kind of on that subject of communicating with some of these other stakeholders. It seems like many of the best protections that we have against ransomware, they tend to happen more on the front end, right? Kind of before an organization gets hit. Has the FBI been doing anything new or different over the past few years when it comes to outreach to the private sector or state and local governments or critical infrastructure in terms of either educating about best practices or maybe getting feedback on what these communities need in terms of resources and support to meet it?
Yeah, so I would say that's an area that we have devoted a lot of effort to in general over the past few years. So specific to ransomware, and I'm sorry, I think I have a frozen screen. Can you still hear me okay? I just want to make sure
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure, because I'm about to say something really important, Derek, and I wouldn't want it to be missed due to technological challenges. No, I think that this is an area where we've had a lot of focus. So a couple of things that we've done specific to ransomware. The FBI helped stand up and is a leader in a whole of government ransomware campaign. So a whole of government effort to try to battle ransomware. And as part of that, one of the things that we've done is 2 years now, we've hosted our own ransomware summit, where we try to bring together some of the leading stakeholders in both the private sector and the and government who can get together and really come up with mutually beneficial solutions and really create that feedback loop that you were talking about and begin to say, well, here are the things that the FBI needs to be more effective at its job, and what are the things that we could do differently to make sure that that we are connecting with the private sector in the right way. So that's one effort that we've undertaken. And then, I think our messaging on ransomware has been, we've really pushed a higher volume of traffic related to ransomware alerts, ransomware warnings, pushing out actual indicators of compromise when we can, and then really partnering with government entities like DHS CISA, who really specialize in that network defense space, to make sure that the threat intelligence that we're seeing as the primary investigative agency is being used, most efficiently in sort of a network defense state. And then the other thing that we've tried to do, certainly we have to try to prioritize some of our efforts. And so one of the trends that we've seen in ransomware that's obviously very concerning is the way that it can affect critical infrastructure sectors across the country. And so really trying to prioritize our messaging to those critical infrastructure sectors, the organizations within them, so that we can protect the most, the most valuable assets that our country has is kind of an important part of our strategy as well.
Yeah, and it does seem, so it seems like there are two things right now that are simultaneously true. One, we've never paid more attention to cybersecurity, cybercrime, and particularly recently, ransomware. It's gotten a lot of attention from policymakers, from law enforcement and the like. At the same time, it seems like the ground level damage that we're seeing caused by ransomware attacks has seemingly also never been larger. And it seems like every day we find a new company or multiple organizations that are getting hit. Do we have the right tools in place to meaningfully grapple with this problem right now? Is there more that we could be doing, whether it's at the Bureau or in terms of the authorities or tools that it might need, or just in terms of the larger government response?
Well, I think we have to sort of consider all options as on the table when it comes to ransomware. And so I don't have the answer to that yet. If I did, I would have already tried to implement it. But I think that your observation is an astute one, which is, we have to explore how we can use all the sort of levers of national power to combat this threat, and not just rely solely on law enforcement actions or solely on private sector, efforts to defend their own networks, or rely solely on the intelligence community. We have to do all those things together, and that's what I would say. I think we do actually have the right tools. The key is, are we using them in the right sequence and the right combination, and are we really leveraging that in every way possible?
I'd love to hear more just about that last part right there. What is the right way, or what you think is the right way in terms of how to use these tools, and what are they?
Yeah, I think for us, and I think there is some trial and error to this, and every threat is a little different, even within ransomware. The groups behind these, the business model that makes up ransomware is, it's different from incident to incident and variant to variant. So some of it will be a fact-based analysis. But I would say that in general terms, one of the things we really want to focus on is, the FBI, I think, really sits in the middle of the government's cyber defensive and offensive efforts. And so for us, what we want to try to do is utilize our investigative authorities, our counterintelligence authorities, and our role as an intelligence agency to really have an impact on the overall cyber criminal ecosystem, which really allows a ransomware attack to occur. There's kind of four pillars or four categories of functions that really need to work together for that criminal enterprise behind ransomware to be successful. So those four things are, there has to be a financial element to it, first and foremost, right? They have to have some way that they can, that the criminal organizations can can cash out and do so in sort of a anonymous or a mostly anonymous kind of way. And really, that's to put it simply, by using cryptocurrency. That's one of the things that's really fueled the rise of ransomware, is a shift from sort of like the pay money pack Western Union type of method of payment to cryptocurrency, which affords much more anonymity and layers of protection. So that's the first thing. It's the first pillar of that ecosystem. The second one for us is the malware development and delivery. There have to be hands behind the keyboard that are creating the malware, that are actually doing the deployment, that stands up whatever vector is the result of whatever vector leads to the ransomware infection, whether that be some kind of botnet that sends phishing emails, or some kind of compromise of RDP tools, whatever the thing is. Somebody has to be the person who develops that method and develops that malware. So that's the second thing that we want to impact. And then the third piece of that cyber criminal ecosystem is communications. So we know that cyber criminals, they work amongst different groups of ransomware variants sometimes, and they are out actually looking and recruiting people to be a part of their criminal organizations. And so in order to do that kind of stuff and to execute their criminal campaign, they have to have some way of communicating that won't draw the attention of the intelligence community or law enforcement. And a lot of times that basically happens on the dark web, as many of the people attending this, I'm sure, already know. So 3 of the 4 I've already laid out: financial, malware development and delivery, communication, and then the last one is really huge, and I think an area for opportunity is infrastructure. Somewhere along the way, there's an architecture that allows these cyber criminals to make their way from point A, wherever that may be in the world, over to point B, and there are stops along the way, in different parts of the world. Point B being your victim, and so in many instances, the people who maintain that infrastructure may not be witting participants in the criminal conspiracy, but in other instances, it could in fact be the case that you have something like a bulletproof host, or something like that. So the ecosystem that I just described is vast, right? Like it's global, and it's impossible for the FBI to really impact that on its own. So we have some things that we can do, like indictments, charges, things that go along with criminal investigations. But then we also gather a wealth of intelligence that could allow us to do. So we have many more options on the table than maybe we exercised, years ago. And so if that means we take intelligence that we have and we work with a private sector company who can have some influence over infrastructure to take down infrastructure that's being used for malicious means, then that's a win in our book. Or if that means that we work with an intelligence community partner, or if that means we work with a law enforcement partner who is in another country to have some type of law enforcement action on infrastructure or forums, or maybe even actual hands behind the keyboard in that foreign country, then that's what we're going to try to do. So that's what I mean. And then I think the magic in all of that is getting the right sequence. And that's just something that we'll eventually do through practice. Knowing when is the right time to exercise law enforcement authorities, and when is the right time to try to collect intelligence that will help us in the future in our efforts against these folks, and when is the right time for the private sector to intervene and take action on its own. And that's what we try to work through on each and every case of significance in the FBI.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it seems like you'll be getting lots of practice around the correct sequence, since we just see so many attacks. So recently we saw this big wave of ransomware attacks hit hospitals and healthcare facilities just a few weeks ago around the country. It shocked even veteran cybersecurity and national security professionals, just in terms of how brazen and reckless it was. I know that you can't talk about ongoing investigations or anything like that, but I did want to ask, have those incidents, I mean, they got a lot of attention in terms of the press, Have you noticed a corresponding uptick of attention and interest from policymakers, from members of Congress? Has that sort of woken up people to the scope of this threat in a way that maybe some of these other attacks haven't?
I think when we published the joint CSA alert with HHS and DHS, FBI, DHS CISA, and HHS published a joint cybersecurity alert, as I think you're probably aware. It definitely got a lot of attention among people in government as well as people in the private sector. But I think it did so in a way that's healthy and good. We want the things that we say, we want it to be impactful. When we come out with our partners and provide a warning like that, we want it to be meaningful. And so I think that I don't want to call it a wake-up call, just because I do think that there are many people in government right now who are very, very attuned to the level of threat that we face from ransomware and are working very, very hard to make sure that we have the right policies in place or get the right policies in place if we don't have them. So I don't want to suggest that anyone was asleep at the wheel, but rather this is just a really difficult problem that we're trying to work through. But I do think that particular alert got exactly the type of attention that it should have gotten. I think the thing I would add to that is that it's one of the more frustrating parts of my job, and I would imagine also true for security professionals in the private sector, that this is the type of activity that we have seen on a pretty consistent basis over the past 2 years, maybe even 3. These aren't the first hospitals that have been attacked by ransomware. We consistently see 911 centers and emergency responders have their critical operations impacted by a ransomware attack. And so, I think complacency is maybe the biggest danger to our efforts, and anything that we can do that sort of nudges us forward to keep us all from becoming complacent about the persistent threat that we face is a positive thing.
Yeah. So let's talk about sort of what is a somewhat controversial issue in when it comes to ransomware. So in October, the Department of Treasury, they put out an advisory that sort of warned companies and individuals that if they do end up paying the ransom to a ransomware group that is subject to U.S. cyber-related economic sanctions, so groups like SamSam, like Evil Corps, that those companies themselves could be subject to civil fines or penalties because you're putting money in the pockets of a sanctioned entity. One thing it does say that Treasury will consider as a significant mitigating factor is if that company or organization is providing a timely and complete report of the attack to law enforcement, as well as their full and timely cooperation with law enforcement both during and after an attack. And I'm wondering, how do you or the Bureau, or however you would like to say it, or other law enforcement organizations, what do you really look for in terms of how you define full and timely cooperation? What does that kind of mitigating level of cooperation look like in your eyes?
Yeah, so we'd have to talk to Treasury about what meets their specific standard, but I can tell you some of the things that that we look for and some of the things that are very helpful to the FBI. I think the number one thing is the report of the ransomware timely? Do we hear about and understanding that in the first 2 hours of an incident, the priority of an internal IR team or a third-party IR team that may be brought in may not be to call the FBI, but our hope would be to learn about that incident within the first 24 hours. Certainly wouldn't say if it was 48 hours that means an entity is uncooperative. We understand that there are other priorities in the wake of a potentially destructive ransomware incident that may take precedence. But we would like to learn about that incident as soon as possible. That's the number one thing. And so, excuse me just a second.
Sure.
And so that would be the number one thing, to report to your local FBI field office, to ic3.gov, or to local federal law enforcement with jurisdiction over cyber criminal activities like the Secret Service. So after that, I think there are certain things that we're really looking for from an evidentiary perspective, and the FBI strives to be to pursue the least intrusive path to that. So in other words, I think sometimes there is somewhat of a myth that if you report a cyber incident to the FBI or a ransomware attack, that the FBI is going to storm the server room or whatever it may be, going to shut down all the business's operations, and we're going to take over and do our searches and forensics for the next 2 weeks. And some of that misconception may be grounded in past experiences from many years ago, but that's really not how we operate. We have worked with many third-party incident response companies to sort of take the work that they've done and glean from that report the forensic artifacts that we need in a ransomware case, which often are very, very limited anyway, given the nature of the attack. It may just be email addresses that were used for ransom demands. It may be maybe some the identity of some file extensions so that we can sort of identify what the variant of that ransomware may be, and then obviously the financial piece, like the Bitcoin wallets or virtual currency destination information that we might be able to use to get some attribution around those actors. Those kind of basic details are really all that we're looking for. I think it's maybe easy to illustrate at the extremes. Like ideally, we'd be having a conversation as we go along, and that conversation, on the good side, would go something like this: an FBI agent reaches out to IT security staff that is responding to an incident like this and says, we're from the FBI. We understand you've had an attack. Here are some of the basic details that we really need to know. And then when we get those basic details, if we have information that we think can help you in preventing further damage or can help you from being re-victimized or can help in any way, then we'll be glad to provide that information to you. But we won't know what to provide you until we really know what the nature of the incident is. And so, and then as we have that conversation going along, and hopefully the FBI is able to provide information that can be of some assistance in the recovery or in future protection of systems. And then that would really be kind of all we would need. But just being able to have that open dialogue is really the kind of cooperation we need. The other side of that coin, and I want to say I totally understand why this happens. When you've been the victim of a cyber incident, one of you're very focused, first of all, on remediating your systems and not necessarily concerned about the overall long-term investigation into the bad guys, because that's the FBI's job. And then the second thing is that there's a fear, is probably the right word, of sort of having your particular incident aired to the world and outed and kind of negatively impacting business reputation, potentially even putting you at a competitive disadvantage. And so we often, when we try to start that conversation, we really just get shut out from the very beginning, and told basically we're not going to cooperate with the FBI. And so that's obviously, that would not meet our expectations as far as full cooperation with law enforcement. So I would say, to kind of wrap up that particular answer, we've really endeavored to be as flexible as possible in trying to go about the business of collecting evidence related to a violation of federal criminal statutes in these circumstances. And we're really willing to kind of mold our efforts to the best of our ability to the needs of the victim, trying to understand the need for business continuity and confidentiality and all of those things. And so what we would hope is just that that victims would sort of meet us halfway and provide us with those basic fundamental investigative details that we need. And I'll be honest, by and large, we find that they do. There are definitely some exceptions, but I think the number of people willing to work with law enforcement on ransomware cases is growing every day.
Well, yeah. So let's stick on kind of that topic of how law enforcement and maybe a victim company might kind of look at things differently. So I know that the FBI, like almost every other law enforcement organization out there, has a pretty firm rule that they believe companies and organizations should not be paying the ransom. I think most everybody sort of agrees that and acknowledges that each time an individual company pays a ransom, it can have a bunch of negative effects on the overall cybersecurity ecosystem, right? It can make these criminal groups stronger. It makes them better equipped to carry out future attacks. It emboldens them. But there does still seem to be sort of a significant gap between the way law enforcement and policymakers view this trade-off and how individual companies see it. So many companies do, in fact, pay the ransom because they're sort of faced with this choice of doing so or just kind of having their business completely ruined. And so many companies sort of take the position or the logic that they don't want to be the one who's takes one for the team for a larger cybersecurity goal. I know that your answer is still going to be don't pay the ransom, but do you understand why companies in that situation might be reluctant to take that hit? Are there carrots in this situation that can be offered, or is it mostly just sticks?
So I think so. You articulated the FBI's position maybe better than I could have. So I won't sort of reiterate that part of it, but just to answer your question, I think we at the FBI are very sensitive and even sympathetic to the position that a victim is put in. And so I think the message from our standpoint is that decision is ultimately going to be, that's not a decision that the FBI is going to wade into on a case-by-case basis. Like, we've provided what we think is the best overall, policy from the administration of justice standpoint, and that is to not pay the ransom. However, we do understand that might be the only real option for some entities who are affected by this. And what we don't want to see happen is for a company to feel that because they have decided that their only choice is to pay the ransom, that they then cannot work with law enforcement because of that choice. Even though that, we provide guidance, but that's not the rule of law or anything like that. And so what we really want to stress is that we're sympathetic to the position that the victim is put in. And even if a victim decides that their best option is to pay the ransom, while we discourage that, we still want to work with that victim because we know that there's still value there in potentially providing information that will prevent future attacks, or also they may have information that will help us investigate the next before the next incident occurs. So that's our position. But we definitely do understand that. And I think that's always been the FBI's position, is that ransom should not be paid for all the reasons that all the bigger picture reasons that you articulated. It emboldens the criminals. It funds their future operations against other victims. But we've always understood that there's a business decision, a business calculus that goes into the decision whether or not to pay a ransom. We want to make sure that we're serving all victims, not just those who make a certain choice.
And so I think we're bumping up against time here, but I did want to get one more question in if we had time.
I've got time for one more.
Yep. So we've seen this sort of larger drift towards within the ransomware space towards a sort of a cooperative, almost cartel-like model of doing business. So you have different groups sharing resources, they're developing complementary malware, they're sharing profits from successful attacks. How has that changed, to the extent that you can kind of talk about it, how has that changed the way that you do your job in terms of keeping tabs on these organizations, investigating them? Does it make it easier because there's so many more kind of connections and relationships that that are out there for you to find, or does it kind of make it harder? How does what has been sort of the effect of, well, first of all, I mean, do you agree with that that shift is happening, and what sort of effect does that have in terms of how you do your job?
Yes, I agree with the way that you articulated it. That definitely squares with what we've seen and what our assessment is of the overall ecosystem. So I would say that that by and large, it doesn't change the day-to-day process as far as investigative techniques that we use to combat that particular threat. At least not in any very significant way. I think what it does. So you asked me, does it make it easier or harder? And that's a really good question. I think in a lot of ways it's probably both for the reasons you articulated. But I think what it does is it makes it a more complex environment, and it honestly it makes our job harder in the sense that I do believe that it produces efficiencies or gains for the criminal enterprises that they can sort of cooperate and operate with one another in that way. And so for us, that's if you look back, not that we have time to do the history of ransomware, but if you look back to when ransomware really kind of came on the scene in 2013 or so, 12, 13, it was a totally different animal perpetrated by a totally different kind of actor, and it was not nearly as sophisticated as it is now. And so I think that is why you have seen our approach to ransomware evolve into trying to impact that cyber criminal ecosystem. So just like you talked about shared services and cooperation and development of specific, custom ransomware solutions, if you will, or custom delivery mechanisms, we had to evolve our approach from just sort of working a single incident to trying to work a particular variant and the whole ecosystem that surrounds that infrastructure, communication, like you mentioned, the financial piece of it, which is there's whole networks just dedicated to the cashing out or the monetization of these criminal activities. So I think what that changed for us because it created a more complex environment where the actors were more sophisticated and more efficient, we had to evolve our approach from just investigating an incident to investigating a whole ecosystem that surrounds a particular type of malware. So that's probably the biggest change.
All right. Well, this has been a super illuminating discussion for me. We are out of time, but Herb Stapleton, thank you so much for carving out some time to talk to us today about this obviously very important issue, and really appreciated the insights. Thank you so much.
Derek, thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to a group like this, and so thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And that concludes our panel today. Thank you.